Good evening. Welcome to tonight's shir, Thursday night evening of Parshas Re'eh. Coming up, Shabbos Mevorchim Elul. So, actually, I have a chassan tonight. So, if I may finish a few minutes early, so you'll forgive me. Meanwhile, let's go into. We have lots of interesting things today. Number one. So, someone asked me a Chumash question. Last week, Sedra, Simlosacha loy volso me'olecha. Your clothing did not wear wear out upon yourselves. And your legs, your feet, did not swell like dough. That's one way of translating. Curiously, the Targum Onkelos translates which is the literal translation, but for the Raglecha, it translates Umesonoch lo yechefu. Your shoes didn't get worn away, or something like that. But he translates Raglecha as your shoe. And so the person was asking, why does the Targum why does Onkelos translate Raglcha as your shoe? So I'm looking at it, and then I see this also in Nesina Lager. There was a chief rabbi in London about a century ago, someone's going to probably tell me exactly, called Rabbi Nosson Adler. And he wrote a commentary on Onkelos. So very appropriate name, Nesino Lager, it's in Lashon of Apostle. It's a contribution of Nosson Adler to Onkelos Hager. So he has the following comment: V'sikeil hametargim es yodov, lahashves es hamalitza lakoidim. Well, there's a certain wisdom here. If the earlier posuk was talking about Hashem providing the mon, vaya'ancha vayarivecha vayachiloscha samon, then it goes on to talk about your clothes didn't wear out, and then your legs didn't get swollen. Wouldn't it make more sense that the welfare of your legs comes before the welfare of your clothing? And so, for that reason, he sees that the raglcha does not mean the legs, but rather it means the shoes. So it's indirectly, but he's saying that it's raglcha, like simlochscha is a garment, an outer thing to the body. So to raglcha. Then he says, what exactly does then Yochef, which you translate loivotsekel, somehow it means worn away, possibly. Okay, that was the Targum Onkelos of last week's Sedra. He translates it as your shoes didn't get worn away. Let's go on to the next thing, which I have on our list. And this is very, very interesting. Not so practical for most of us, but there's a country called Iceland, and it has lots of volcano heat. I was there once and saw they have miles of piping bringing the heat from the volcanic area into the build to where people live. They don't have to have central heating. They don't have to boil water even, I believe, because they have got on tap volcanic heat, and it's this like miles of these insulated pipes bringing the heat from the volcanic area into town. So now there's another shtick that there's areas where there's soil, where the ground is warm, so they make ovens, and there's a tourist attraction. You come today, and you'll make a loaf of bread, and you'll put it into the ground, leave it for 24 hours, and it'll get baked. Of course, today's tourists don't wait 24 hours for their bread. So yesterday's tourists' bread is eaten by today's, and today's tourist bread will be eaten by tomorrow's. So now the question is being asked, is bread baked in geothermal heat? Does it come into the Isur of fas nachri, of Goisha bread? That's the question. Not as I say, not terribly practical. And even there, I don't think it's terribly practical, because I would say that who knows what ingredients may have been put in yesterday's bread that you should be able to rely upon, that it shouldn't be past, just because of the ingredients. Never mind pas akum. Before going to this, let me also just go into a little detail. There's a difference between pas palter and pas akum. Pas palter is bread of a baker, and pas akum means of a private person. And there's much more latitude, much more leniency of bread of a baker. So if there's no pas Yisrael available, there's a heter to use pas palter. But pas balabayis is more chomer. There are some who are mati, but overall it's more chomer. In our situation, this given situation, is this called pas palter or pas balabayis? On the one hand, it's not made by commercial bakers, it's made by tourists to do. On the other hand, if the reason for pas palter being more lenient is because there's no familiarity, it's just a commercial thing. So perhaps here also there's no familiarity. I don't know who yesterday's tourists were. So I can see both ways. But meanwhile, just in the principle, does pas akum apply to bread baked in geothermal heat? So interestingly, in the dinu of bishul akum, that does not apply to chamitveria, etc. There are various forms of preparing food which are not included in bishul akum. For example, smoked hamaushon einoi ke mevushol b'gzeira zeh. That's the Lashon Rambam. Smoked fish is not included in bishul akum. It's tasty, but the whole bishul akum is because I make you nice food, a special. It's tasty. Then that creates a social closeness. But if it's not a normal way of preparing food, a somewhat unconventional way of preparing food, then that doesn't engender the closeness of which would bring to chasnus. That's the way under Chazal understood. Now, what I have on the screen for you is from a sefer, very much a contemporary, called Chelkas Binyamin. If you don't know who he is, well, his father-in-law has published the several sforim called Badei HaShulchan, who, like Mr. Brewer's style, on parts of Yeridea, and his son-in-law has done several parts, a few volumes. The first one being on the dinim of Bishul Akum, etc. So pas akum, this is kufyud base. Kufyud base is pas akum, kufyud gimel is bishul akum. So he makes this distinction, and he brings a raya from Rashi in Broches, talks about asur and kelimudim, and it looks like that the issue of pas akum would apply even if it's baked in the sun, not baked in an oven. And so that's the beginning. He's starting off with a mashmos from the Gemara and the way Rashi learns that for pas, even if it's not baked in the conventional way, it is still subject to pas akum. Let's read here the bottom section. Avol gzeir de chasnus shall pass. So pas akum was also to create a social barrier. Yesh loy mashu toli be'etzem shem pas, v'loy b'masi afio sheba. It doesn't matter how it was made. Is it called bread? That's the main thing. And the lechem udava choshem mitzad atzma. So when it comes to cooked foods, so how it was cooked would also play a role in the kirvo chash chasnus. When it comes to bread, so it's bread. It's edible as bread. That's enough. So on this basis, he's taking the view that that bread baked in unconventional forms, as in baked in the sun, or in this case the geothermal, would be subject to the dinim of pas akum, pas palter, etc., which I find it very interesting, because in many areas, as we know, pas is more lenient than bishul. The fact that you have the heter of pas palter and you don't have, according to most poskim, you don't have a heter of bishul palter, possibly because bread is more of a staple. And therefore they made it more lenient. But here he shows one angle where even if it's baked in an unconventional way, it also would be included in pas and be subject to the guidelines of pas akum, pas palter, etc. Okay, let's go on to the next topic, also in Yeridea, but another different section. Here we have on the screen we have a door to a storage, looks like under the stairs, and on the right side, let's say it's the doorpost is 1.5 meters, and on the left side the doorpost is a meter, but perhaps a bit less. And the question is about putting up a mezuzah, and at what height do you put the mezuzah? Does the word mezuzah go on the third of the height, the top third of the height of the doorpost, or the top third of the height of the doorway? So before going into that detail, whether this cupboard this storage needs to have a mezuzah is questionable. I doubt that it has an area of 4 by 4 amos, which is about 2 meters square, at the height of 10 tefachim. It's not so far-fetched, by the way. Someone just spoke to me this past week talking about under the eaves of the roof and in the loft. Often it's quite low, but it could very well be that it has 10 tefachim high. It's not comfortable to walk in an area which is 10 tefachim high. You know that, yeah? Um, yeah. One of my sons has a joke. Two men walked into a bar. Ouch. Um, so walking this very low loft, which is only 10 tefachim high, is not so comfortable. But it could be. It's got 10 tefachim high and 4 by 4 amos. It's not so far-fetched. But I doubt that that is the case in this cupboard. It should be so wide. But there's a chumrah, there's a shitta mentioned in Piskei Teshuva, that even such a cupboard, as long as it's a walk-in cupboard, so should have a mezuzah. So they're putting a mezuzah, okay. But these are side details. Here's a question on the diagonal. So how do you measure? So what I answered the questioner was the following. The minimum width of a doorway is 4 tefachim. So within the triangle of the top of the doorway, measure where the horizontal would be 4 tefachim. Above that is not doorway. From there and lower down, that's where you'll measure your height of your doorway, and then you'd put the mezuzah in the top third of that area. It may be that then it will be parallel, it may be even higher than the vertical post on the left. But in what I'm presenting is that the first part of the diagonal side of the triangle is also considered the vertical. It's still considered the doorpost rather than the lintel. It's only one at the top. When it becomes only less than 4 tefachim wide, that's when it stops becoming a doorpost. So that's the way I answered. On the left of the screen, you have a copy from the Sefer Seichel Tov, which I mentioned many times, a specialist on Sefer Mezuzah, and he discusses this question. He's not sure, but I'd also like to share with you that there's another very much a contemporary Sefer Mezuzah called Shari HaMezuzah, and he brings an interesting angle on this. I use the word angle, otherwise it's a slip up, but yeah, that there's a Gemara, the whole sugya of there's two sugyas in Gemara about mezuzah. One is in the beginning of Yoma, and when the bigger sugya is in Menachos. So there's the lashon pische shimoi, which I think the word crude doorways would be part of mezuzah. So the typical example would be, let's say the doorway isn't a straight vertical, but there's bricks sticking out, bricks sticking in. It's jagged. So that's one example of piskei shimoi. So a crude doorway does not need to have a mezuzah. So some of the recent achronim want to say that a diagonal lintel is not normal, and therefore it's considered piskei shimoi and potter mezuzah. So whilst here, in any case, we're talking about a chumrah job, because it's a thing under the stairs. But I wouldn't put it past some of contemporary designers to build a diagonal door for a whole room. It looks a bit, how do you say the word, funky perhaps. And then there will be a question whether that's called chayiv b'mezuzah or not. So according to these achronim, a diagonal lintel would not be considered a proper doorway to require a mezuzah. So of course, you put up a mezuzah, but you would not make a bracha when doing so. Let's move on to the next thing. This is I found very, very interesting. We're coming up to Yom Menorah, and we have in the slichas leading up to Rosh Hashanah, we have three piyutim, which are the focus of a controversy, whether it's okay or not okay to appeal to Malochim to pray for you, to appeal to Midas to pray for you. So you've got Machnise Rachamim, which is said towards the end of Slichas, just before the Targum, Mache o Mase. Then we've got Malachi Rachamim, Meshorse Elyon. I think that's for the third day of Slichas. And then we've got the Shlosh Esrei Midas poem, Pisman, which is said on Erev Rosh Hashanah. So there's this controversy whether to say the poil. We do say them now, but here what you can see on the screen, there have been changes. The other two somehow escaped unscathed, but the Shlosh Esrei Midas, the earlier printers, had changed the text to avoid this impression that we are praying to the Midas. And then we've got in Chabad Slichas, it's been changed back. Chazoras Atorah L'Yoshna. And so I'm going to show you now two things. Our Rebbe, in the lifetime of the Frierdiker Rebbe, was very into getting a clarity on minhagim, including tefillah, slichas, what is said, what isn't said. So B'chayev of the Frierdiker Rebbe, the Rebbe prints a rishima, a list of each day of slichas, what is said, what isn't said. Tov Shin Tes Vov, the Rebbe prints a slichas. In that slichas, it has the Shlosh Esrei Midas published with this following text. Tov Shin Chov Gimel, which is by the Rebbe was celebrated 150 years from the Alter Rebbe's Histalchos, and a slichas comes out in second edition. And here there's 4 pages of notes of the Rebbe. I find it fascinating that you're talking about 13 years into the Nesias, and the Rebbe prepares this bibliographical list of notes on the slichas, and it's 4 pages. This is the author, and it's gone to Aleph base, this style, that style. Fascinating how the Rebbe found time. And what it says to me is, if the Rebbe spent such precious time on giving us the history of those slichas, well, it tells us how special they are. Meanwhile, as I say, in the Tov Shin Chov Gimel edition, there's this long paragraph analyzing the Yud Gimel Midas. He starts off its Shalmoinis. So luckily, I came across a different slichas this past week, and I found out what Shalmoinis means. Shalmoinis is a style made up of a stanza made of 4 lines, and it's attributed to the style of someone called Shlomo. That's called Shalmoinis. Before I get to that, lower down, this is earlier on in the Rishima, where the first the Rebbe comments on the Machnise Rachamim poem, and he says in the note, we do say it, in the note he says a whole discussion. In Yehuda Yalef from Yehuda Asad, there's a whole discussion. Then there's a Chassam Shofar, and then there's a commentary on the Ikrim called Anafim, and there's a quote from the Shtanya Rabsi, and then there's a Gemara who brings a raya from the Gemara in Sanhedrin that it's okay. And then we have in the intro to Eitzat Tfilis, the Tzemach Tzedek in Sheresh Mitzvah Tfilah brings for the Korban Nasanel, who is not very pro at all. But then the Tzemach Tzedek in his notes to which were written later, the Tzemach Tzedek wrote to Sheresh Mitzvah Tfilah when he was mamash a young man. The whole story, the Alter Rebbe, the granddaughter showed the Alter Rebbe. Meanwhile, but the other thing is a later note of the Tzemach Tzedek, where he says we're not asking the angels to do anything for us. as in to give us something of their resources. We're just appealing to them to be the appropriate shliach, to bring the shefa milmaila lamato, and to elevate the tefillas. And the idea of the malochim elevating tefillas is a well-known idea in Gemara and in Zohar, etc. Okay, so in this note, the Rebbe is saying, although there are those who are apprehensive about saying these piyutim, but lepoil it's accepted that we do say them. So we do say machnisi rachamim, etc., etc. So now coming back to our topic. So we have here the Yud Gimel Midas. As I said, this is said on Erev Rosh Hashanah. And here the Rebbe in this long note shows how the printers wanted to avoid the impression that we are praying to the actual Midas, and therefore they made various changes. In all, the Rebbe shows 10 or so changes between what the printed version is and how it should have been, how it probably was in the original. And what I find fascinating is that in Tovshin Chav Gimel, in the actual slichas, it still stays the old text. But in the note, there's a note at the back. I remember from about Tovshin Lamed Gimel, approximately, where we were giving out, in Shul, we were given a sheet of, a double-sided sheet, which had this piyut in the corrected version. Now, I did a little bit more looking around. The Slichas was printed again in Tovshin Chof Tes, and it still had the old version. Tovshin Lamed Hey is there now the upgraded version of Shlosh Midas, and that's why I wanted. So the Rebbe again in Tovshin Chof Gimel has made a note of this long note of how it should be corrected. Doesn't do anything about it in the actual text for the next 3 runs, and the fourth run in Tovshin Lamed Hey it is updated, but somehow there's a circulated amongst Anash a piece of paper. I found my father's slichas, I found my father's slichas, this paper, which is this upgrade, and as I remember it from around Tovshin Lamed something, the early Lameds. Okay, so now let's take a look at the screen. First of all, the Rebbe has pointed out the name of the author is Shloime, what was it again? Shloime ben Menachem Chazak, yeah? So, and that's alluded to in the Rosh Tevis. So, Shloish Midos, yeah? Shloish, that's right, that's Shin Lamed Mem, and Hey Ho Amoros, that's Shloime. Bachanino no is Ben, Mido Nechoino Chali Malki is Menachem. So, this is Shloime ben Menachem, and then Chapes Zekhus Keruim is Rosh Tevis Chazak. Okay. So you got here the remez for the name of the author, Shloime ben Menachem Chazak. Now, before I'm jumping ahead, that I'm going to show you in a moment another text published by Daniel Goldschmidt, who has, instead of Knuyim spelt with a kof, he has Knuyim spelt with a kuf. As in, the Eibishter's Chamisha Kinyonim HaKadosh Baruch Hu has, and one of them is Yisrael Kinyan Echad. Lechapes Chus Knuyim as acquired. So the Rosh Tevis of Chazak comes earlier rather than later. Okay. So now that's the Rosh Tevis of the name. Now, for the Rosh Tevis, you need to have the word the ches of Chali. But here it says achale. In the earlier print, it says achale, not chali, beseech, beseech, or on my behalf. Achale, I will beseech. Similarly, in the beginning of the second stanza, second part, it has avakesh aleim rachim, I will request. Whereas in the original version, it's bakshi aleim rachim aleim, you midonechoino beseech. So, and as I say, there's about 10 of such changes. So I'm mystified. As I say, there's about 10 changes between the printed version, which I say is sensitive to this, not appealing to the midas, and to the later version, which is kind of going back to the original version. I'm not worrying about that. And that was noted by the Rebbe in Tovshin Chav Gimel. But it looks like it was only acted upon about 10 years later. And I'm curious what was the reason why in Tofshin Lamed something did uh, did someone publish that piyut with the what I call Hachzora Torah L'Yoshna to the original form. So I find here a volume of Slichas now by Reb Daniel Goldschmidt. Now he was an expert in tefillah, in an analysis of the text of tefillah, published several works, but one of the in Tofshin Chofhei he publishes a Slichas. And so here again we have same piyut Shloishes Lemidas, and as you can see he has Chali Malkech instead of Achale, and that was how the Rebbe had changed that. But there's several there you can see the Knuyim rather than with a kuf rather than with a kof. Knuyim was with a where was it again? It was Knuyim, but it was nicknamed, and it's Knuyim with an A. Kuf means owned. Um, right. So he looking. So he has several changes, and all the Rebbe's recommendations kind of are borne out, almost all. But what I found is, and this I took the trouble to make a list. We have here the original, shall we say, the published text, the list of the Rebbe's changes. Then call from Dana Karosek. Then we have the list of the Rebbe's changes, then the way they were implemented in the upgraded version. Now they are different. If you can see here it's Bakish Rachamim the Rebbe had written, then it was Bakshi Rachamim. So someone had obviously worked on after the Rebbe's note, had then, before they published this, circulated this one, two-sided page, someone had worked on it and upgraded it after the Rebbe's note. So I'm curious who that was, and then you have here the Goldschmidt's version, which is again different. So it says here it says lechapes, here it says chapes, etc. So to say that Goldschmidt's version was the cause of the Rebbe's upgrade to be released, but then why was Goldschmidt's version not taken on completely? So I'm really puzzled, and I've asked a couple of people who might remember things from about 60 years ago. Yeah, 50 years ago, 60 years ago, what actually was the cause of that changeover? From Tofshin Lamed Hey onwards, the Slichas Chabad have got the upgraded version, as it was in that circulated piece of paper, but not with Goldschmidt's changes. Okay, yes. Okay, something simpler. Someone asked me this week, a shliach somewhere in Europe, and he had a bunch of 5 turned up. I don't know who they were, tourists, but a Bochrim. Possibly they were doing Mivtzoim. But they came there and they wanted to Kriyas HaTorah. But there were only 5 of them who had not heard Kriyas HaTorah. And so one of them said, oh, according to Tzedek, it's enough to have 3 who haven't heard Kriyas HaTorah. Now, there are such opinions, and someone wrote to me today that Remendel Schneebal in Manchester took the view that if you have if it's during a minyan, and there's only 3 people who haven't heard, you can still do Kriyas HaTorah. So there are those who say that in the context of Kriyas of Tefillah B'Tzibur, then you can rely on that. Now, I remember my father, Olav Shalom, was a sheikhet, and Shochtim had to get out of the house very early because the butchers wanted to have fresh meat at 9 o'clock in the morning. And so the Shochtim had to be in the shecht house, in the slaughterhouse, in the abattoir at 5 a.m. already. They were 5, 6. They were already shechting then. So the shochtim didn't have the chance of downing with a minion for most of the year. So it was very often my father would come the afternoon, would already finish the shkita, and come for mincha in the summer. And before mincha, I would scrape together a minyan to do kriyas HaTorah. Some people were not so excited, as if to say that Chabad are introducing a minig of doing kriyas HaTorah at mincha, but that wasn't the kind of thing which would faze my father, as those who remember him. He actually was once in Manchester at a bris, and one of the local moyalim was snooping over his shoulder, and he says, if you do a bris on that child, I'm going to have to report you to the Initiation Society. My father said, I wasn't worried about Stalin. I'm not going to worry about you either. Um, but he would make this, but he always would look for 6 people who hadn't heard the Kriyas HaTorah. That was obviously the Messiah which he had, and that's what I would say is the case. Now, where did the Bet Tzemach Tzedek come in, though? See, someone says Tzemach Tzedek. So we've discussed this before, that especially during COVID, it came up that in the town of Tzemach Tzedek there was a epidemic in, and particularly in the town of Niezhin, where his son Bisonech was the Rav, or the Rebbe, and the Tzemach Tzedek was very concerned that his son Bisonech should not fast because of the weakened state, making him more vulnerable. Meanwhile, he says, this is about Tisha B'Av. ונדוין קריאס ויכל, יש דעה שאפילו יש רימו מסענים, סג ליקרס ויכל, בדל צוימס הקבועים בימי הנביאים. So Maselik says, you're worried about Kriyas HaTorah. You've got these people, they would have preferred to fast. They can't fast because of health concerns. Okay, but if you miss out Kriyas HaTorah, so Maselik says, you've got 3 people who are fasting. In other words, the people who are extra strong and not have to worry about the being vulnerable. So you've got 3 people who are fasting, that would be enough to do Kriyas HaTorah. But then he adds, why is that? It's because although in Shulchan Aruch, this is a thing which is not so well known, you read in Shulchan Aruch, it says, you need to have 10 people fasting for Kriyas HaTorah. Yeah? To do Kriyas HaTorah on a fast day, you need to have 10 people. Not 6 fasting. It's 10 people. And it's more chomer than Stamase. And that is, but that's talking about not a Tanis Kavua, but rather a voluntary Tanis, like a Cheret Kadisha kind of thing. So there you'd have to have 10 people fasting, otherwise no Kriyas HaTorah. When it comes to Dalet Soimes, you can say, listen, the occasion is an occasion in any case. It's a Soimes Mikvui Mimehanavim. You have in Sefer Zechariah, whatever it is, or it's in I think it's in Zechariah. They mentioned about Soim Arviv, Soim Chamishi. So the fasts were already mentioned in the Mehanavim. And therefore, even if the people are not fasting, but the occasion is an occasion. So therefore, even the people who are not fasting can make up the minyan. So, all right, so there is a Tzemach Tzedek who talks about on a fast day, where during the epidemic, so then you can rely on doing Kriyas HaTorah if 3 people are fasting. The other people haven't heard Kriyas HaTorah either. Yeah. To leapfrog from this and say, oh, Tzemach Tzedek says it's enough to have 3 people who haven't heard Kriyas HaTorah is not actually true. Yeah, it doesn't. The Tzemach Tzedek here is relying on a tziruf. First of all, it's a Shas Chag, and is relying on a tziruf that there are those who say that even they're not fasting, they are mitzaref, they are eligible for Kriyas HaTorah, etc. And then he has about 3. So it's a tziruf of several things together. It's not a basis to say that Tzemach Tzedek says you can do a Kriyas HaTorah with only 3 who haven't heard Kriyas HaTorah. As I said, the Masorah which I have, which I saw, was that we are mishtadel to find 6 people who haven't heard Kriyas HaTorah. Right, let's go on to the next thing, and that is we've discussed this perhaps in the past. We once discussed about a person who has a unibrow, which means that his eyebrows go all the way to the middle, which people find off-putting and they want to be able to remove it. But here's a slightly different question about trimming the eyebrows. And I was overgrown, and so we have here on the screen a sefer, a contemporary sefer, who says it is okay to trim the eyebrows, not to remove them totally, and not to shape them, which would be more like a feminine way of doing things, but just to trim them if they're overgrown. He brings sources which say that it is okay. I'm going to go on to the next thing, and that is a number 7. So someone asked, this is number 8 on the screen, but number 7. So the question is the following: we have a fence, but it's for a yard to be able to carry, but it's not 10 tefachim high. So now I want to rectify the situation by putting up Tzuras HaPesach. They're putting up 2 poles on either side and a wire over the top, a string over the top, and that should make it, we know Tzuras HaPesach is an alternative to having a solid wall. Fine. He's asking, where does the Tzuras HaPesach go? The Tzuras HaPesach has to be 10 tefachim high. Is that 10 tefachim high from the floor or 10 tefachim from on top of the fence? In other words, does having a fence in the middle of your, if you've got a Tzuras HaPesach, which is 10 tefachim high, and half of that is a fence, does that ruin your Tzuras HaPesach? That's basically his question, which is a good question. I'm not totally sure of the answer, but I told him a simple an alternative solution. So if your fence is, let's say, 8 tefachim high, so then you can just tie a string from side to side, just 2 tefachim up, and then that creates a lovud. Well, so you can see that in a lot of places here in Stamford Hill, that the people have fence walls in front of their gardens, and they're concerned it's not full 10 tefachim. So just to tie a string, a tefach up to 3 tefachim above, and that fills in with through lovud, and that makes into a Yochid much simpler. It doesn't have the restrictions of a Tzuras HaPesach. You'd have to have the string over the top of the posts, whereas here, just to create a lovud, can be wrapped around the post. It's a bit simpler. It doesn't have to be. Yeah. So I offered that an alternative instead of having to have extra poles and then having working out how high. Just through lovud, it could be solved simpler. Okay. So here we have a question. Reuven, someone says it's a real question. Yeah? He sent me this by email, WhatsApp, whatever. So Reuven lends Shimon $500, and Shimon gave Reuven his laptop as a mashkin. And a month later, Shimon Reuven's in his care. The laptop got damaged, so Reuven wants his $500 back, but the collateral of the mashkin, the laptop, is now not worth the it's lost in value. So does Reuven have responsibility for that damage, and therefore Shimon does not have to pay him back the full money? That's the question. So really, everyone who's learned, Abor Shoimrim, so you've got Shem Sochar, Shem Echina, Shem Sochar, and the Shoyel. What is the status of a shomer, of a lender who has a mashkin? Is a Shem Chinam, Shem Sochar, or a Shoyel? And so it's a discussion in Gemara, and this remains a machlokas in Shulchan Aruch, whether it's a Shem Chinam or a Shem Sochar. The difference would be that a Shem Chinam is only liable for recklessness, and if it was stolen, or the name of Aved is potter, but both of them are potter if there was an oinus, if there was a damage beyond control, totally unexpected, they would be potter. So a lender who takes the mashkin is definitely not on the level of shoyel. He's either on the level of shem chinam or shem sochar. So really what has to be established is the damage to the laptop. How did it happen? Did it happen through recklessness? In which case, Reuven has to bear the responsibility, and therefore he's not going to get his $500 back. Whatever cut out compare the loss, etc. So if it was pshia, recklessness, so then Reuven bears full responsibility. If it was through oinus, this is interesting, yeah. So let's say, chas v'sholom, there had been a fire, and the laptop was ruined in a fire. Then that's, I would say, normally is a total case of oinus, and therefore Reuven can say, "I'm sorry about your laptop, but it was lost through an oinus. I'm not liable for that, and you still owe me the $500." That would be the halacha. Maybe more details, but that's broadly the position. Let's move on. So now someone asks me about a yogurt machine. They have this yogurt machine, and they're asking whether it's does it really become milchik because the yogurt is on a very low temperature. Does that make it into milchik? So really, first of all, the question is, what is the temperature for Yad Soledes boy? How do you, in degrees, how do you measure Yad Soledes boy? So in Shmiras Shabbos Kilchosa, in the first, right at the beginning, Bishul, he defines that 45 degrees Celsius would already be considered Yad Soledes boy. Curiously, the yogurt machine reaches 45 degrees Celsius, and therefore it is going to be considered Yad Soledes boy. Although it's not very hot, but it's enough to be considered Yad Soledes boy, and therefore it is boileya. In addition to that, I was thinking on the lines of when it comes to kashering, there's something called the base se'or, a pot in which you keep yeast. Now, although it's not it's not hot, but because yeast is has got a strong flavor to it, such a strong flavor, it will make that pot, that container chomet stick, for example, even though there's no heat involved. So possibly something like yogurt. Perhaps it does have a certain strength to it, but that perhaps it would make the thing milchik even without the heat, just because. Then the third thing is that I was thinking about kavush. Now, there is a halacha, if you leave liquid in a container for 24 hours, then the container will have absorbed the flavor even without any heat. And therefore, I was thinking perhaps that would apply also with the yogurt, that the yogurt container becomes milchik by the mere fact that the yogurt has been sitting in there for 24 hours. Well, I'm sharing this with you because I found an interesting chiddush that the din of kavush is only with liquid which is fluid. But what happens if it's something which is more dense? So there's a contemporary sefer that says mayonnaise. Mayonnaise doesn't flow. It is, well, it's not a liquid, yeah, it's thicker than that, it's more viscous. And something which doesn't flow would not be subject to the din of kavush, which I found quite interesting. I'm not sure of the lomdus, but on that basis, a yogurt which becomes set would not have the din of kavush. But it doesn't matter. The first point I think remains valid, that because it reaches 45 degrees, that's already considered Yad Soledes boy, and it becomes milchik in any case. I have two more points to share with you. One is on the screen, and that is someone sent me one of our listeners in the United States. We had a discussion a few times of late about the input, what's the value of Chazor Sashatz, in addition to our own davening quietly. So here's called a mimer of the Rebbe from Tofshin Memches. Yesh loima, this is the inner reason for the halacha that the Shliach Tzibur says first the quiet Shemona Esrei, although he could have been yotzei by his loud Shemona, by his repetition. Why does he have to say it quietly first? And b'di'evid, there are cases where if he made a mistake, forgot Yalav Yov or something, then he can be yotzei with Chazar Sashatz. And the reason given in Nigla is, that says Gemara end of Rosh Hashanah, let's give a chance for the chazan to kind of to rehearse, to pull his thoughts together, tzilosis sedura. So he does it first a quiet Shemona Esrei to prepare himself, and then he'll do the Chazor Sashatz. B'pnimius yesh leima, says the Rebbe of Shabbazer Nirmas, that in this is alluded to that in the chazan there are two inyonim. One aspect is one of the 10, and one is that he is the shliach of the 10. So there's two levels. One is his davening quietly along with everyone. There he's one of the 10, and there's another aspect where he's the shliach of the 10. We call them moving the inyan hatfilah betzibur hu tachlis ha'achdus. So whereas when you're one of the 10, each one is doing their own tefillah, although albeit at the same time, that's one level of achdus. When we're all doing the same thing at the same time. There's a greater achdus Shliach echad lekulam, where all of the voices are fused into a single voice, and that's the Chazoras Hashatz. It's a different level of Achdus achieved by Chazoras Hashatz. Okay, thank you. And the last thing I want to share with you is the following. As I've told you a couple of times, I'm involved in this course of Eon Tefillah, and I've late given a shir about Ashrei, why we say Ashrei, why the Posuk Ashrei is said before Tehillah David. The main thing is Tehillah David, and we have two Psukim, Ashrei Yeshvei V'secha, Ashrei Hamshkochalei, Ashrei Hamshkochalei, Ashrei Hashem Alekov. Why do we say those three times Ashrei? Two Psukim, but three times Ashrei. So I mentioned, I saw in Sforim they say three times Ashrei is correspond to the fact that we say three Ashrei three times a day, or correspond to Avraham, Yitzchak, Yaakov. So I want to share with you an original thought. Here we have the famous Gemara Sukkah talking about the celebrations of the Simchas Beis HaSheva. And it says you have these Hasidim v'Anshe Maaseh who are dancing, and everyone else was around and looking on. Yesh mehen oimrim, there are those who would say, Asher Yaldosenu, happy is our youth, Sheloibisha Ziknosenu, which is not an embarrassment to our older age. Elu Hasidim v'Anshe Maaseh, people who had been pious all the way through. So then they are grateful that their younger years don't embarrass their older years. Yesh mehem oimrim, there are those who would say, Ashrei Ziknosenu, happy is our senior years, Shekipro al Yaldosenu, which has atoned for our years of youth. Ele Balat Shuva. So they say, yeah, when we were kids, we were messing around a lot, but Baruch Hashem, we reached a stage of maturity to be able to rectify. And this explanation is talking about Shuva Me'ave, Zeynus Nasle Kezochies, Ele Balat Shuva. Elu ve'elu Imrim, both of these categories would say, Ashrei Misha Lechoto, happy is the one who hasn't sinned, or Misha Choto, one who has sinned, Yoshuv, he shall do Shuva v'yimchalei. So I see here three times Ashrei. So I'm suggesting that the three times Ashrei is corresponding to the three in these three Ashreis. And I just want to finish off. Reb Mendel Futterfass somehow saw that I needed extra attention. So he used to schlep when he used to come to England and go to Manchester, Gateshead, and so he schlepped me along to, to keep him company, etc. In his later years. And so in Manchester, they used by the Fabrengen, they used to sing Ashrei Shelechato, Ashrei Mi Shelechato, famous Chabad niggun. But then they would go. Then the niggun would go in. The Rebbe used to call it the Manchester Nusach. Mishechato Yoshu 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 Yim Choloi. And then they go have Ashrei 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 Misheloichato Mishechato Yoshu 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 Yim Choloi. To go in a high pitch. So just wanted to share that with you. Going into Shabbos Mevorchim Elul. So there's Ashrei, and everyone can look back. Some things we can say, oh yeah, Ashrei Yaldosenu Shlei Bisha. Some things we can say, Ashrei Ziknosenu, that we manage to sort things, improve. Either way, the Madam saying Ashrei, Madam saying Freilach, and so with that I'll finish off. Freilach and Chodesh Harachamim, and Besachazeno Ineinu Beshucha Letziyim Barachamim. We should see Beshuv Hashem Shivas Tzion and the Shvuyei Tzion should be returned, and we should have a Geula Shlemo with Moshiach Tzidkeno B'Mheirav Yameinu Mamish. Kol Tov.